Is it possible that everything we have been seeing all this time was nothing more than a mask? And what if one staff confession suddenly shatters the way we view Taehyung, to the point where Jungkook's name becomes almost impossible to imagine in the same context? That question explodes in the reader's mind from the very first line, not merely as cheap clickbait, but as a gateway into a narrative that feels academic, dramatic, and deeply emotional, because it challenges one of the most basic assumptions about the Korean entertainment industry, an industry long believed to be polished, controlled, and meticulously calculated. When a staff member from the project publicly known as VType finally spoke up, the words that came out were not safe, nor were they the kind of diplomatic statements the public is used to hearing. Instead, they ignited a new sense of unease. This was not acting, this was not a script, and what happened behind the scenes was far more complex than fans had ever imagined. From the moment VType was first introduced, many assumed that every expression Taehyung showed was part of an artistic concept. The empty stares, the pauses that felt too long, the smiles that appeared only to vanish as if swallowed by his own thoughts. Everything was framed as art. Cultural studies scholars even interpreted this style as a deliberate deconstruction of the classic idol persona, a conscious effort to break public expectations. But what if that interpretation was wrong? What if what we have been calling performativity was actually a reflection of a very real emotional state? The staff member directly involved in the production of VType described an atmosphere that was anything but theatrical. Without explicitly naming names, the details given were so specific that they were hard to dismiss. They spoke of moments of silence that were never captured on camera, of Taehyung sitting alone far longer than scheduled, of a stillness that was not part of any director's instruction. If that was acting, the staff member said, then there is no actor alive who could maintain it once the cameras stop rolling. That sentence spread rapidly, triggering a cascade of new questions. If this was not acting, then what was it? It is at this point that Jungkook's name emerged, not as the main subject, but as a comparison that shocked many. The staff member mentioned that imagining Jungkook in the same condition felt impossible. That word was not chosen lightly. Impossible did not mean better or worse, but rather pointed to differences in emotional structure, in how pressure is processed, and in how each BTS member navigates the world around them. This statement immediately stirred emotional reactions among fans, because Jungkook has long been perceived as a figure of resilience, adaptable, strong, and relatively stable amid the storm of the industry. But why did this comparison feel so unsettling? Because it quietly shattered the illusion that all members of a global group experience and respond to pressure in the same way. In academic discussions of idol culture, it is often argued that a uniform training system produces emotionally homogeneous results. The fact revealed by this staff confession directly challenges that theory. Taehyung, with all his complexity, appears to be moving along a different emotional trajectory, one that may have been disguised for years under the label of concept. Another, sharper question soon followed, and it cut deeper than most were prepared for. Has the public been too quick to admire without truly understanding? Has praise for a dark concept or a mysterious aura actually closed off space for empathy toward the human condition behind it? The staff member hinted that there were moments when even the production team themselves felt uncertain, not about the quality of the work, but about the state of the person at its center. Doubts like these rarely reach the surface, because the industry is not designed to display its cracks. The narrative grew even more emotional when a staff member revealed that some of the scenes considered the most artistically powerful were, in reality, the loneliest moments on a human level. Taehyung was not playing a role, he was fully present as himself. This is where the boundary between art and reality begins to blur, forcing the public to confront an uncomfortable question. Are we admiring art, or are we unconsciously consuming vulnerability? Jungkook's name surfaced again, this time in a more reflective tone. The staff member explained that Jungkook, with all his charisma, tends to process pressure internally while maintaining a steady working rhythm. Imagining Jungkook experiencing the same emotional condition as Taehyung at that moment felt unrealistic for the team. Not because Jungkook is stronger, but because their ways of facing the world have always been fundamentally different. This remark opened a new discussion about psychological diversity within a group that is often treated as a single, unified entity. Fan reactions quickly split into opposing currents. Some felt hurt, realizing that what they had enjoyed might have been born from a fragile emotional state. Others felt enlightened, finally discovering a more human context behind work they had long admired. On social media, questions multiplied, collided, and overlapped, forming a collective emotional storm that was difficult to control. Was this a violation of privacy? Or was it the first step toward a more mature understanding of idols as human beings? What made this story simultaneously clickbait-worthy and deeply painful were its implications for the future. If VType truly captured emotional reality rather than performance, how should the public respond going forward? Will every future work by Taehyung be interpreted as a portrait of his inner state? Will every smile from Jungkook be compared, unfairly transformed into a benchmark of emotional stability? The staff member concluded their confession with words that felt more like a warning than a revelation. They said that the industry often forgets that emotional honesty is not a resource that can be exploited without consequence. That sentence lingered because it placed responsibility not only on agencies and media, but also on an audience constantly hungry for dramatic narratives. At this point, the reader is left with an unresolved sense of unease. There is no definitive answer, no official clarification to calm the storm. What remains are fragments of clues, pieces of testimony, and emotions that feel too real to ignore. Is this the beginning of a shift in how we view Taehyung? Will Jungkook continue to be held up as a symbol of resilience that may itself conceal unseen layers? One thing is certain: the VType staff confession has altered the narrative. It forces us to pause, take a breath, and ask an honest question. When we say this is not acting, are we ready to face the truth that comes with it? And if imagining Jungkook in the same position feels impossible, does that mean we have been oversimplifying the human beings behind the enormous name of BTS? These questions offer no comfort, but that is precisely their power. In a world accustomed to flawless illusions, a single visible crack can be more meaningful than 1,000 dazzling stages. And perhaps that is the greatest surprise of all. Not the staff confession itself, not the comparison to Jungkook, but the realization that behind global spotlights lies an emotional reality that can no longer be safely disguised as a mere concept. What makes this situation even more unsettling is how quietly it reshapes the way fans remember past moments. Scenes once replayed for aesthetic pleasure are now being revisited with a different lens, as if meaning has shifted overnight. A pause that once felt poetic now feels heavy. A gaze that was praised for its depth now raises questions about exhaustion, isolation, or emotional overload. The staff's words did not accuse, did not dramatize, yet they planted doubts so effectively that silence itself became evidence. And in an industry where silence is often curated, this kind of silence feels dangerously honest. Observers of Korean pop culture have long argued that idols exist in a paradoxical space, simultaneously hypervisible and deeply unknowable. Taehyung's case, as implied by the VType staff, seems to embody this paradox perfectly. He is seen by millions, dissected by analysts, celebrated by critics. Yet the core of what he was experiencing during that period appears to have gone largely unrecognized. The academic framing of his work as experimental art now feels incomplete, as if an entire layer of human context was missing from the analysis. What complicates the narrative further is the absence of a clear villain. There is no single decision-maker to blame, no obvious moment of exploitation that can be neatly condemned. The project continued, the cameras rolled, the content was released, and the public responded exactly as expected. This raises an uncomfortable question that few are willing to confront directly. Can something be ethically troubling even when no rules are explicitly broken? The staff's testimony suggests that the answer may be yes, and that realization is far more disturbing than a simple scandal. Jungkook's recurring presence in this discussion continues to act as a mirror rather than a contrast. His name surfaces not to diminish Taehyung, but to highlight difference, a difference that fans may have subconsciously ignored in their desire to see BTS as an indivisible whole. The idea that one member's emotional state could be impossible to imagine for another challenges the comforting narrative of shared experience and equal burden. It suggests that unity does not erase individuality, and that shared success does not guarantee shared resilience. This realization has sparked quieter conversations among fans, away from trending hashtags and viral clips. Some speak of guilt, wondering whether their enthusiastic consumption of content overlooked subtle signs of struggle. Others push back, arguing that interpretation after the fact risks romanticizing pain. Both reactions reveal a community grappling with its own role in the ecosystem, unsure where appreciation ends and intrusion begins. The staff's confession also subtly reframes the concept of authenticity, a word often celebrated but rarely examined. Authenticity is praised when it feels inspiring, raw in a way that still entertains. But what happens when authenticity is uncomfortable, when it does not resolve neatly into a message of growth or triumph? The implication that VType captured moments of unfiltered emotional reality forces audiences to confront authenticity not as a brand, but as a responsibility. Industry insiders, though largely silent, are reportedly not surprised. For those familiar with long-form projects that demand emotional immersion, the line between performance and lived experience has always been thin. What is new here is not the existence of that line, but the fact that someone acknowledged crossing it. The staff member did not frame it as a mistake, but neither did they celebrate it. The neutrality of their tone is perhaps the most revealing aspect of all. As the discussion continues, one cannot ignore how this revelation alters expectations for the future. Will Taehyung feel pressure to reassure fans that he is okay, even if that reassurance becomes another performance? Will Jungkook be further cemented into a role of emotional stability, burdened with an image that leaves little room for vulnerability of his own? These possibilities underline how narratives, once formed, tend to harden quickly in the public imagination. There is also the question of memory. Years from now, when VType is referenced as a defining artistic moment, will this context be remembered alongside it, or will it fade beneath more convenient interpretations? Cultural memory often favors clarity over complexity, yet this story resists simplification. It exists in a gray area where art, labor, emotion, and expectation overlap in ways that are difficult to categorize. Perhaps the most profound impact of this entire situation lies not in what was revealed, but in what remains unsaid. The staff member did not describe breakdowns or dramatic confrontations. Instead, they spoke of endurance, of quiet persistence, of moments that did not interrupt production but lingered afterward. This kind of emotional residue rarely makes headlines, yet it shapes the lived experience of those at the center of creative industries. In the end, the question that echoes most strongly is not whether Taehyung was acting, or whether Jungkook could ever be imagined in the same state. The deeper question is whether audiences are prepared to hold multiple truths at once, that a work can be beautiful and troubling, authentic and exploitative, intentional and accidental. The VType revelation does not demand outrage, but it does demand reflection, and perhaps that is why it feels so unsettling. It offers no easy resolution, no clear stance to adopt. It simply opens a door and leaves it open, inviting anyone who steps through to reconsider how they watch, how they admire, and how they empathize. In doing so, it transforms a single staff confession into something much larger, a quiet challenge to the way modern pop culture is consumed, understood, and ultimately remembered. As time passes, the weight of that open door only grows heavier. The longer the silence from official channels persists, the more space there is for interpretation, and in that space, meaning multiplies. Fans begin to read between lines that were never meant to be read. Critics revisit old interviews with a sharpened curiosity, and even casual observers sense that something fundamental has shifted. This is no longer just about one project or one confession. It is about the fragile contract between those who create, those who are created around, and those who consume. The idea that Taehyung's emotional state may have been fully present, unfiltered, and unintentionally documented raises questions about consent that are rarely addressed openly. Consent in this context is not legal but psychological. At what point does agreeing to a creative process stop accounting for the cumulative toll it takes? The staff member's words imply that there was no single breaking point, no dramatic refusal, only a continuation that felt normal until it was later understood differently. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect because it suggests that harm does not always announce itself loudly. In contrast, Jungkook's perceived emotional steadiness has begun to feel like a narrative shield, one that protects audiences from confronting their own discomfort. By labeling him as someone for whom such a condition is impossible, the discussion inadvertently places him at a distance from vulnerability, turning him into a symbol rather than a person. This raises another uncomfortable possibility, that the public may be more comfortable with emotional complexity when it is assigned selectively, rather than acknowledged as a spectrum that exists within everyone. The emotional undertone of this story also exposes a deeper contradiction in fan culture. Fans often demand authenticity, craving moments that feel real and unpolished, yet recoil when confronted with the responsibility that comes with witnessing that reality. The revelation surrounding VType forces a reckoning with that contradiction. It asks whether the desire for closeness to idols has quietly crossed into a desire for access to their inner lives, regardless of cost. From an academic perspective, this moment may later be identified as a turning point in how idol labor is discussed. Traditionally, emotional labor in K-pop has been framed as part of professionalism, an expected extension of performance. What the staff member hinted at complicates that framing. Emotional presence, when sustained over long periods, becomes labor of a different kind, one that is harder to quantify and easier to overlook. Taehyung's experience, as suggested here, sits uncomfortably at that intersection. The absence of outrage is itself telling. There has been no widespread backlash, no calls for cancellation, no dramatic rupture. Instead, there is a low, persistent hum of discomfort. This quiet reaction may indicate a growing maturity in the audience, or it may signal uncertainty about how to respond without oversimplifying. Either way, it marks a shift from spectacle toward introspection, a rare movement in an ecosystem driven by immediacy and noise. As the narrative continues to unfold through interpretation rather than confirmation, the emotional distance between Taehyung and Jungkook becomes less about comparison and more about individuality. The staff statement, initially perceived as divisive, can also be read as an affirmation that there is no single correct way to endure pressure. This reading, however, requires resisting the urge to rank resilience, an urge deeply ingrained in competitive cultural frameworks. There is also the lingering question of how Taehyung himself might perceive this discourse. Would he recognize himself in these interpretations, or would he feel further misunderstood? The irony is painful. An attempt to humanize can easily become another form of projection. The story reminds us that visibility does not guarantee understanding, and that even well-intentioned narratives can drift away from lived reality. In the long term, the legacy of VType may not lie solely in its aesthetic achievements, but in the conversations it continues to provoke. In the long term, the legacy of VType may not lie solely in its aesthetic achievements, but in the conversations it continues to provoke. It may become a reference point in discussions about ethical creativity, about the limits of immersion, about the unseen costs of sincerity. If that happens, the staff member's brief, understated confession will have had an